The retirement home smelled of lavender and regret. Martha Keveney sat by the window every afternoon at 3:15, watching contrails carve the Arizona sky into geometric patterns. The other residents knew her as the quiet woman in 12B who never attended bingo night and kept a faded photograph on her nightstand, a younger version of herself standing before something large and gray, her hand resting on metal that caught the sun. The nurses called her sweet, harmless. A veteran nurse, they said, from some war nobody talked about anymore. They were half right. The visitors came on a Tuesday. Two men in dress blues, their shoes so polished they reflected the fluorescent hallway lights. They asked for Martha Keveney, and when the receptionist pointed toward the dayroom, something passed between them, a glance that carried weight. The younger one, a captain with ribbons Martha recognized from 30 years of watching ceremonies on television, cleared his throat twice before speaking. The older one, a colonel whose weathered face belonged to someone who understood what silence cost, simply waited. Martha didn't look up from the window. "I haven't flown in 23 years," she said, her voice carrying the rasp of age and something else, something that made the colonel straighten his spine. "Whatever you need, I'm not your pilot anymore." The captain opened a folder. Inside was a photograph of an aircraft, sleek and predatory, banking hard against a sunset that painted its underbelly in shades of copper and blood. "Ma'am, we're not here about flying," he said carefully. "We're here about Mongoose." The name hung in the air like cordite smoke. Martha's fingers, steady until that moment, trembled against the armrest. Outside, a commercial jet traced its path westward, ordinary and unremarkable. She watched it until it disappeared into clouds that looked like cotton but felt like memory. 23 years since anyone had called her that. 23 years since she'd heard her call sign spoken aloud by someone who understood what it meant. The colonel stepped forward, his shadow falling across her lap. "There's a situation," he said quietly. "Someone's using your tactics, your exact maneuvers from the Gulf, the ones that aren't in any manual, the ones you never wrote down." He paused, letting the words find their target. "We need to know if you taught anyone, if you passed them on." Martha closed her eyes. In the darkness behind her lids she could still see it, the desert sky at dawn, the way her F-16 had felt like an extension of her own body, the radio chatter that had gone silent the moment she'd done the impossible. She'd been 34 then, a lieutenant commander they'd called reckless behind her back and brilliant to her face. Now she was 57, wearing orthopedic shoes and cardigan sweaters that smelled like mothballs. "I didn't teach anyone," she said finally, opening her eyes to meet the colonel's gaze. "Because what I did wasn't supposed to work." The flight records arrived in a manila envelope so thick it required 2 rubber bands. Martha spread them across the dayroom table after dinner, when the other residents had shuffled off to watch game shows and pretend their lives still held surprise. The captain, his name was Morrison, she'd learned, and he flew tankers out of Travis, had left them with a phone number written on the back of his card. "Call when you're ready," he'd said, as if she'd ever be ready to revisit the desert and what she'd left there. The first page was a mission brief from 3 weeks ago. Somewhere over the South China Sea, an American surveillance aircraft had been intercepted by hostile fighters. The details were sanitized, scrubbed clean of anything that might make headlines, but Martha could read between the redactions. She'd spent enough time in briefing rooms to know what aggressive maneuvering meant, what international waters really implied. What caught her attention wasn't the incident itself, but the description of how the American pilot had responded. A climbing barrel roll initiated at Mach 0.92, transitioning into inverted flight while maintaining positive G-load throughout. The attacking aircraft had overshot, lost position, broken off. Martha's hand moved to her throat, finding the small scar there, a reminder of the oxygen mask that had cut into her skin during a maneuver exactly like that 30 years ago, when the rule book said such a thing would tear an aircraft apart. She turned the page. Another incident, 2 weeks prior, different location. Same result. Then another and another, each one a ghost of her own muscle memory translated into someone else's hands. Whoever was flying these missions had learned from watching her, studying her, understanding not just what she'd done but why she'd done it. The thought sent ice through her chest. Morrison's number glowed on her phone screen. She dialed before courage could abandon her. He answered on the first ring, as if he'd been waiting beside the phone like a teenager hopping for a date. "Ma'am," he said, and she could hear the relief in his voice. "Who's flying the missions?" Martha asked, skipping pleasantries. "Who's using my work?" A pause, static on the line, or maybe hesitation. "We don't know," Morrison admitted. "That's why we need you. The pilot, whoever it is, they're good, too good. They're making moves that shouldn't be possible in the aircraft they're flying. Chinese analysts think it's AI-assisted. Russians think it's a new flight control system, but we know better." "You think it's human," Martha said. "We think it's someone you trained. Someone who watched you closely enough to replicate maneuvers you invented on instinct." Another pause, longer this time. "Someone who might be trying to send you a message." Martha looked at the photographs spread across the table, contrails frozen in time, aircraft banking through moments that could mean war or peace depending on whose hand was on the stick. In one image, she could see the silhouette of the pilot through the canopy, helmet turned slightly as if looking back at the camera. At her. "I'll come to Washington," she said, "but I want full access. Everything you have on these incidents. No redactions." "Ma'am, some of that material is." "I know what it is, Captain. I also know you came to a retirement home in Arizona because you're desperate enough to ask a 57-year-old woman who hasn't flown since the Clinton administration for help. So either give me what I need, or find someone else who can tell you why your pilots are getting embarrassed by tactics that died with the Cold War." Morrison's laugh was short and sharp. "Colonel Reeves said you'd say something like that. He's authorized your clearance. There's a car coming for you at 0600. The Pentagon smelled exactly as Martha remembered, floor wax and ambition, and the particular staleness of air conditioning that ran 24 hours a day. Morrison met her at the security checkpoint with a visitor badge that felt like a collar, restrictive and necessary. He walked half a step ahead, the way young officers did when they weren't sure whether to treat her as an elder statesman or a relic. She let him wonder. The briefing room was deep in the building's core, where windows became a memory and fluorescent lights washed everything in the color of exhaustion. Colonel Reeves waited inside, along with 3 other officers whose faces carried the particular weariness of people who'd spent too many nights staring at satellite feeds. A large screen dominated one wall, currently dark, promising revelations. "Ms. Keaveney," Reeves said, standing. He didn't salute. She wasn't active duty anymore, but something in his posture suggested he wanted to. "Thank you for coming." "Martha is fine," she said, taking the offered seat. The chair was standard government issue, designed by someone who'd never considered the human spine. "And I'm here because you made it sound like someone's about to start a war using my playbook. So let's skip the thank yous and show me what you've got." Reeves nodded to Morrison, who dimmed the lights. The screen blazed to life with footage from an aircraft gun camera, the timestamp marking it as 17 days old. Martha leaned forward, her trained eye immediately cataloging details. The curved horizon marking high altitude, the white exhaust plume of the pursuing aircraft, the calm voice of the American pilot reporting the intercept. Then it happened. The American aircraft, a P-8 Poseidon, she recognized it from the wing configuration visible in the mirror-like reflection on the canopy, suddenly pitched up. Not a standard evasive maneuver, but something more aggressive, more calculated. The nose rose sharply, the aircraft rolling simultaneously, G-forces that should have stressed the airframe beyond safety margins. The Chinese fighter pursuing it shot past, its pilot caught off guard, unable to match the maneuver. Martha's breath caught. She knew that move, had invented it over the Iraqi desert when a MiG had gotten too close and her wingman was too far away to help. She'd called it the Scorpion back then, a strike that came from where enemies least expected, using the aircraft's momentum against every principle of aerodynamics she'd been taught. "Play it again," she said quietly, "slower this time." Morrison obliged. In slow motion, she could see the precision of it, the exact angle of attack, the way the pilot maintained control through a maneuver that should have induced a stall, the split-second timing that meant the difference between brilliance and catastrophe. "Who's the pilot?" she asked. "That's classified," one of the other officers said. A major, his name tape reading SULLIVAN, his expression suggesting he disapproved of civilians in his briefing room. Martha turned to look at him, and something of mongoose must have flickered in her eyes because Sullivan shifted in his seat. "Son, I invented half the tactical doctrine your instructors teach at Pensacola. I've been cleared for this briefing, which means Colonel Reeves thinks I can help. So either tell me who's flying that aircraft, or explain to him why you're wasting my time and the taxpayers' money." Reeves cleared his throat. "The pilot is Lieutenant Commander Daniel Kauna, naval aviator, 12 years experience, currently assigned to VP-16 out of Jacksonville. Exceptional record. Prior to this incident, no history of unauthorized maneuvers or tactical deviations." "Kauna," Martha repeated, testing the name. It meant nothing to her. "Where'd he train?" "Pensacola, then advanced training at Fallon. Standard pipeline." Morrison pulled up a service record, and Martha scanned it quickly. Commendations, deployments, the usual trajectory of a competent but unremarkable career. Nothing that explained how he'd learned a maneuver she'd performed exactly once, 30 years ago, in a different aircraft, in a different war. "Show me the others," she said. They watched 6 more incidents, each one a variation on themes Martha had composed in cockpits that no longer existed. A split test that turned into something more complex, using vertical space in ways that manual writers considered impossible. A high yo-yo that incorporated a roll rate no P-8 should achieve. Each maneuver was executed perfectly, as if the pilot knew not just the moves but the philosophy behind them. The understanding that aircraft were less machines than extensions of will, that physics was negotiable if you understood where it bent. By the 4th video, Martha had stopped sitting. She stood before the screen, arms crossed, watching each frame as if it might reveal secrets the analysts had missed. "They're all Kauna?" she asked. "Different pilots," Reeves said. 7 incidents, 5 different aviators, all Navy, all patrol or surveillance aircraft, and before you ask, no connection between them. Different squadrons, different bases, 3 haven't even met." Martha felt something cold settle in her stomach. 1 pilot learning her tactics was possible. 5, independently, was something else entirely. "Someone's teaching them," she said, "running them through training that isn't in any curriculum." "That was our conclusion," Sullivan said, his earlier hostility replaced by something like respect. "The question is who, and why now after 3 decades?" The screen changed to show a map of the Pacific, red dots marking where each incident had occurred. They formed a rough arc from Japan to the Philippines, all in international airspace, all in areas where American surveillance aircraft routinely operated. "The pattern suggests someone preparing for a specific scenario," Reeves said, "teaching our pilots how to survive intercepts without escalating to weapons." "These aren't survival maneuvers," Martha corrected. "They're dominance maneuvers. You use them to tell the other pilot that you're better, that engaging you would be suicide. They're designed to humiliate, not escape." Morrison looked uncomfortable. "With respect, ma'am, that sounds aggressive, possibly escalatory." Martha smiled without humor. "Captain, I spent 8 months flying combat air patrol over the no-fly zone. You know how many times I had to fire my weapons? 0. You know why? Because after the first 2 intercepts, Iraqi pilots started turning away the moment they saw my aircraft. That's what these maneuvers do. They establish dominance without pulling a trigger. They end fights before they start." "Or they start wars," Sullivan said quietly. The room fell silent. Outside, Somewhere in the building's labyrinthine corridors, phones rang and keyboards clattered and the machinery of national defense ground forward. Inside, 5 people stared at images of aircraft dancing through hostile skies, each one a small spark that could ignite something vast. "I need to talk to them," Martha said finally. "The pilots, all 5." Reeves exchanged glances with Sullivan. Some silent communication passed between them, the kind that happened between officers who'd worked together long enough to develop their own language. "That might be difficult," Reeves said carefully. "They're scattered across 2 oceans, and pulling them all to Washington would raise questions." "Then I'll go to them," Martha said. She turned from the screen, meeting Reeves's eyes directly. "You brought me here because someone's teaching my work. That means someone who knew me, who studied me closely enough to understand not just what I did but how I thought. If these pilots have been trained by that person, they might have information without knowing it. A phrase, a teaching method, something that could point us toward who's running this program." "You think it's a program?" Morrison asked. "Not just, I don't know, pilots studying historical footage?" Martha shook her head. "The footage from my missions was classified until 8 years ago, and even if they watched it, learning these maneuvers from video is like learning surgery from YouTube. You need hands-on instruction, someone who can talk you through the G-forces, the muscle memory, the instinct. Someone who's done it themselves." The C-37 military transport shook with turbulence somewhere over Nevada, and Martha gripped the armrest with fingers that remembered different aircraft, different skis. Morrison sat across from her, working through a tablet filled with files she couldn't see from her angle. He'd been quiet since they left Andrews, and she appreciated it. Too much conversation would force her to acknowledge what she was doing, returning to a life she'd spent 23 years trying to forget. Her phone buzzed. A text from the retirement home's director asking when she'd return, reminding her about medications and appointments. Martha deleted it without responding. Some bridges burned themselves. "First stop is San Diego," Morrison said, looking up from his tablet. "Commander Khanna's squadron is running exercises this week, but he's agreed to meet with us during a maintenance window. We'll have about 2 hours. "What have you told him?" Martha asked. "That a civilian consultant needs to discuss tactical procedures. Nothing about you specifically." Morrison hesitated, then added, "He's nervous. Most pilots would be, getting called in to talk to Pentagon brass about their flying." Martha nodded. She remembered that nervousness, the way it felt when senior officers wanted to discuss your performance, the uncertainty about whether you were being praised or investigated. "Does he know the maneuvers are unusual?" she asked. "He knows they're effective, knows they work. Whether he understands they're not supposed to be possible," Morrison shrugged. "That's what we need to find out." The Pacific appeared below them, vast and impossibly blue. Martha watched it scroll past, remembering other oceans, other missions. The Persian Gulf had been brown and angry, full of oil smoke and burning wells. This water looked cleaner, cold despite the California sun. She wondered if it felt different when you flew over it at 500 knots, if the color changed when you saw it through the reflections of pursuing aircraft. North Island Naval Air Station materialized through the haze, runways and hangars, and the controlled chaos of a military base at work. The C-37 landed smoothly, and Martha felt her body remember the deceleration, the way everything inside you wanted to keep moving even as the aircraft stopped. Morrison gathered his materials, his movements efficient and practiced. "One thing," he said as they waited for the crew chief to open the door. "Khanna's good, really good. Before these incidents, he was being considered for instructor duty. If we spook him, if he thinks he's under investigation, we might lose any chance of finding out who taught him." Martha understood. Pilots were prideful creatures, defensive of their skills and suspicious of outsiders questioning them. "Let me lead the conversation," she said. "I know how to talk to people like him. I used to be one." The hangar smelled of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid, and the particular metallic tang of aircraft undergoing maintenance. A P-8 Poseidon sat in the center, its engine cowlings open, technicians swarming over it like careful ants. Near the back of the hangar, a man in a flight suit stood beside a small office, his posture suggesting he'd rather be anywhere else. Daniel Kauna was younger than Martha expected, maybe 35, with the lean build and steady gaze of someone who spent their life making split-second decisions. His eyes tracked their approach, assessing, calculating. When they were close enough, he straightened and extended a hand. "Commander Kauna," he said, "though I guess you already knew that." "Martha Keaveney," she replied, taking his hand. His grip was firm but not aggressive, the handshake of someone confident in their skills. "Thanks for meeting with us." The office was cramped, filled with technical manuals and safety posters, and a coffee maker that looked like it had survived multiple wars. Kauna cleared space on a desk, moving clipboards and maintenance logs with the casual efficiency of someone who'd learned to work in chaos. He didn't offer coffee. Smart man, Martha thought, keep this professional, maintain distance. "So," Kauna said, settling into a chair that squeaked under his weight, "the captain here said you want to discuss tactical procedures, specifically some of my recent flying." Martha studied him. There was wariness in his expression, but also something else, curiosity, maybe, or the kind of pride that came from knowing you'd done something remarkable. "The maneuver you used during the intercept 17 days ago," she said, deciding on directness. "The climbing roll when the Chinese fighter closed on you. Where'd you learn it?" Kauna's expression didn't change, but his fingers drummed once against his knee, a tell, small but significant. "Standard evasive tactics," he said carefully. "Things we practice in training." "Commander, I've reviewed the training syllabus for P-8 aviators. That maneuver isn't in it. Neither are the G-loads you pulled or the roll rate you achieved. So I'll ask again, where'd you learn it?" A long silence. Outside the office, someone dropped a wrench, the clang echoing through the hangar. Kauna looked at Morrison, then back to Martha. "Who are you exactly?" he asked. "Captain Morrison said civilian consultant, but you're talking like someone who knows aircraft." Martha smiled. "I flew F-16s during Desert Storm, logged 400 combat hours over the no-fly zone. Before that, I was an instructor at Nelly's. And I'm asking about your maneuver because I invented it in 1992 over Iraq, when a MiG got too close and I had about 3 seconds to do something impossible or die." Kauna's eyes widened slightly. "You're Mongoose," he said, the words coming out like recognition, like revelation. "You're the pilot from the stories." Stories, the word hit Martha like turbulence. She'd been gone from the service for 2 decades, had thought her reputation died with her retirement. But apparently, somewhere in the pipeline of military aviation, her call sign had survived, passed down like folklore. "What stories?" she asked carefully. "The ones about the pilot who could make an F-16 do things it wasn't supposed to do, who got into knife fights with MiGs and won without firing a shot. The instructors used to talk about you at Fallen, said you'd left the Navy before they could figure out how to teach what you knew." Kauna leaned forward, his wariness replaced by something like excitement. "You're real. I always thought it was just, I don't know, one of those legends people tell to make training interesting." Martha felt something twist in her chest, pride and discomfort mixed together. She'd never wanted to be a legend, had specifically requested no publicity after certain missions. But pilots talked, and apparently they'd been talking for 30 years. "The maneuver you used," she said, redirecting. "If you didn't learn it from official training, where did you learn it?" Kauna hesitated. Martha could see him weighing options, deciding how much to reveal. "About 6 months ago," he said finally, "I started getting emails. Technical breakdowns of historical combat maneuvers, videos that looked like they'd been digitized from old gun cameras. No sender information, just a generic address. At first I thought it was spam, almost deleted them." "But you didn't," Morrison said. "No, because the first video showed an F-16 pulling a maneuver that shouldn't work. a climbing barrel roll at high speed, transitioning to inverted flight without losing energy. The email included the math, showing exactly how it was possible if you hit specific angles and maintained precise control inputs. So I watched the rest. Martha's hands were steady on the desk, but inside, her mind raced. Anonymous emails teaching her tactics to pilots she'd never met. Someone with access to classified footage, with the technical knowledge to break down her instinctive decisions into teachable moments. Someone who wanted these skills disseminated without leaving a trail. "How many emails?" she asked. 47 over 6 months, Kana said. Each one focused on a different maneuver or tactical concept. Some included historical context, where and when the moves had been used. Others were pure technical breakdowns, physics and aerodynamics. Whoever sent them understood not just how to fly, but how to teach. Morrison was taking notes, his expression grim. "Did you report this? Protocol requires disclosure of any unusual contact related to operational matters." Kana had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I should have, but the information was valuable and nothing in it was classified. It was all about historical tactics, stuff that happened decades ago. I figured someone was trying to help, maybe an old-timer who thought modern pilots had gotten soft." "Who else received these emails?" Martha asked. "The other pilots from the incident, were they getting the same instruction?" "I don't know, we never discussed it, but—" Kana pulled out his phone, scrolling through screens until he found what he wanted. "There's a forum, unofficial, invitation only. Pilots share techniques, discuss tactical problems. About 3 months ago, someone started a thread called Lost Art of Knife Fighting. Posts started appearing with some of the same concepts from my emails. Different writing style, but the same underlying philosophy." He handed the phone to Martha. The forum was bare-bones, text-heavy, the kind of place serious professionals gathered when they didn't want oversight. The thread he'd mentioned had over 200 posts, pilots from different services discussing close-quarters aerial combat, sharing videos and analyses. And threaded throughout, like a whisper campaign, were concepts Martha recognized. Her concepts, the tactical philosophy she developed through trial and instinct, and the kind of fear that made you creative. "Can you trace the original poster?" Morrison asked. Kana shook his head. "The forum's encrypted, anonymous. That's kind of the point. People can discuss things without worrying about official scrutiny or career implications." Martha continued scrolling, reading posts that dissected maneuvers she barely remembered performing. One analyzed her use of vertical space during a 1993 intercept, breaking down how she'd converted altitude into energy to outturn a more maneuverable opponent. Another discussed her timing, the way she'd learned to read enemy pilots through their aircraft's movements. It was like reading her own mind translated into academic language, made teachable and systematic. "This is more than just historical interest," she said quietly. "Someone's running a training program, using me as the curriculum, teaching a generation of pilots to fight the way I did." "But why?" Morrison asked. "And why now after all this time?" Martha thought about the Pacific, about rising tensions and the careful dance of aircraft in contested airspace. She thought about how wars started, not with declarations and invasions, but with small escalations, misunderstandings, moments when the wrong pilot made the wrong choice. "Because someone thinks we're going to need it," she said. "Someone thinks the next conflict won't be fought with missiles and stealth, but with close-quarters maneuvering. And they're making sure our pilots can survive it." They flew to Okinawa next, where Lieutenant Commander Sarah Vance waited with the same nervous energy Kana had shown. Then to Guam for Lieutenant Jason Park, and back to Washington State for the others. Each interview revealed the same pattern: anonymous emails, forum discussions, gradual dissemination of tactics that shouldn't exist. By the time they returned to Washington, Martha had filled 3 notebooks with details that refused to form a coherent picture. The pattern was clear, but the source remained invisible. Whoever was teaching her tactics had covered their tracks expertly, using encrypted communications and anonymous routing that Morrison's technical experts couldn't penetrate. The emails came from different servers scattered across 3 continents. The forum posts traced to VPNs that ended in dead ends. It was professional-grade operational security, the kind that spoke of either significant technical sophistication or insider knowledge of how military investigations worked. Could be foreign intelligence, Sullivan suggested during their final briefing, teaching our pilots to be predictable, setting them up for countermeasures we don't know about yet. Martha shook her head. These tactics work. Every pilot who's used them came away intact, accomplished their mission. If someone wanted to set us up for failure, they'd teach us maneuvers that looked good but collapsed under real pressure. These don't. These are the real thing. Then who benefits from making our pilots better? Reeves asked. The question hung in the air, unanswered. Martha stared at the map on the wall, red dots marking incidents across the Pacific, and tried to think like the person behind this. Someone with access to her old missions. Someone who understood her tactical philosophy well enough to systematize it. Someone who believed strongly enough in these techniques to risk court-martial for unauthorized training programs. A ghost of an idea began forming in her mind. "Pull the personnel files," she said suddenly. "Everyone who served with me during Desert Storm, every WSO, wingman, ground crew member, anyone who would have had access to my mission footage and been close enough to understand my thinking." Morrison looked doubtful. "Ma'am, that was 33 years ago. Most of those people are retired or—" "Do it anyway, and cross-reference with anyone who has technical skills, computer science, communications, that kind of background. Someone who could set up this kind of distributed teaching network." The search took 2 days. Martha spent them in a hotel near the Pentagon, unable to sleep, watching cable news that spoke of rising tensions in the South China Sea, of near misses between American and Chinese aircraft, of admirals testifying before Congress about readiness and deterrence. Each story felt connected to her investigation in ways she couldn't articulate, as if her past was reaching forward to shape a future she barely understood. When Morrison finally called, his voice carried an edge of excitement. "We found someone. Matches all your criteria. Captain Benjamin Acaffer, former electronic warfare officer. Flew with you during your second deployment, 1993. After the service, he got a PhD in computer science, worked in Silicon Valley for 15 years. Cybersecurity, encrypted communications, exactly the skills needed to run this kind of operation." Martha felt her pulse quicken. Benjamin. She remembered him, quiet, brilliant, the kind of officer who saw patterns others missed. He'd flown in her back seat during some of her most dangerous missions, had talked her through the technical aspects of electronic warfare while she focused on keeping them alive. "Where is he now?" she asked. "That's the thing," Morrison said. "He retired from the private sector 5 years ago, moved to the Philippines, bought property near Subic Bay, and ma'am, Subic Bay is right in the middle of where these incidents have been happening." The Philippines smelled of salt and cooking fires and the peculiar sweetness of tropical decay. Martha stood on the deck of the ferry crossing Subic Bay, watching the water reflect a sky threatening rain. Morrison stood beside her, seasick and trying to hide it, one hand gripping the railing with white knuckles. They'd flown commercial this time, less conspicuous than military transport, and now approached Benjamin's property by the most indirect route possible. The address led them to a compound on a hillside overlooking the bay, surrounded by flowering trees and the kind of high walls that spoke of privacy rather than luxury. A guard at the gate checked their identification with professional thoroughness, spoke briefly into a radio, then opened the gate without comment. Someone had been expecting them. Benjamin waited on a veranda that caught the breeze coming off the water. He was older, grayer, his lean frame gone soft in the way of men who traded flight suits for civilian comfort. But his eyes were the same, sharp and analytical, missing nothing. When he saw Martha, something crossed his face. Recognition. relief, maybe even satisfaction. "Mongoose," he said, and the call sign in his voice carried 30 years of weight. "Took you long enough to figure it out." Martha felt anger flare, hot and immediate. "You've been teaching classified tactics to active-duty pilots without authorization, running what amounts to a training program outside official channels. Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you're in?" Benjamin smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Trouble? Martha, I'm trying to prevent a war. Sit down. Let me explain before you call your friends at the Pentagon and have me arrested." Morrison's hand moved toward his phone, but Martha stopped him with a gesture. "Talk," she said, settling into a chair that gave her a view of both Benjamin and the bay below. "Make it good." Benjamin poured tea from a pot that had been waiting, his movements deliberate and calm. 5 years ago, I was consulting for a defense contractor. They were analyzing intercept patterns in the South China Sea, trying to predict where confrontations were likely to occur. The data was troubling. Chinese pilots were getting more aggressive, testing American responses, pushing boundaries. And our pilots were responding exactly as they'd been trained, by the book, predictable, professional. "That's what training is for," Morrison said. "Consistency, predictability, safe outcomes." "Safe outcomes require both sides following the rules," Benjamin countered. "But what happens when one side decides the rules don't apply? When aggressive maneuvering becomes the norm and our pilots have only textbook responses?" He looked at Martha. "You never flew by the book. You understood that real combat was about improvisation, about making the other pilot blink first. That's what kept you alive." Martha sipped the tea. It was good, green tea with jasmine, the kind she used to drink during late-night mission planning. "So you decided to teach my tactics to a new generation, without asking me, without clearing it through any official channels." "Would they have approved it?" Benjamin asked. "Would the Pentagon have authorized teaching maneuvers that violate safety protocols and push aircraft beyond their documented capabilities? Or would they have buried it in committees and reviews while our pilots kept flying predictable patterns that get them killed?" The veranda fell silent except for wind through the trees and distant boat engines on the bay. Martha wanted to argue, to defend the system she'd once served. But she remembered sitting in briefing rooms where innovation was discussed as risk, where anything that couldn't be standardized was dismissed. She remembered the frustration of knowing better ways existed, but being unable to implement them because they didn't fit the manual. "How many pilots have you taught?" she asked finally. "Directly, 17 through the emails and forum. Indirectly, maybe 100 as they share what they learn with squadron mates. It's organic growth, the way knowledge is supposed to spread, pilot to pilot, not bureaucracy to manual to training program." Morrison was on his phone now, speaking in low, urgent tones. Probably calling Reeves, getting instructions on how to handle a former officer running an unauthorized training program. Martha didn't stop him. Instead, she stood and walked to the veranda's edge, looking out over the bay where American ships had once dominated, where new powers now contested every mile of water and sky. "Did you know what you were starting?" she asked Benjamin without turning around. "Did you understand that teaching these tactics would put pilots in positions where they'd have to use them? That you were effectively changing American doctrine without authorization?" "I understood that pilots were dying." Benjamin's voice was flat, factual. "Not in combat, not yet, but in accidents, in training exercises, in moments where they pushed beyond their training and didn't have the skills to survive. The official statistics don't capture it. They classify them as pilot error or mechanical failure. But I've seen the reports. I know what happens when competent pilots encounter situations their training didn't prepare them for." Martha turned back to face him. "And the timing. Why start this 5 years ago? Why the Pacific specifically?" Benjamin's smile was grim. "Because the data showed me where the next war starts. Not if, Martha, when. And when it does, it won't be fought with stealth bombers and cruise missiles in the first hours. It'll be fought with patrol aircraft and interceptors, with pilots trying to avoid escalation while protecting their missions. Your tactics, our tactics, they give those pilots a chance. They turn potential shoot-downs into embarrassed retreats. They prevent wars instead of starting them. Morrison finished his call and approached, his expression troubled. Colonel Reeves wants you both in Washington. There are questions about operational security, about whether any of this constitutes espionage or unauthorized disclosure of classified material. He paused, looking uncomfortable. Captain Akafor, you're not under arrest, but the colonel strongly suggests you come voluntarily. Benjamin looked at Martha, not Morrison. Will you vouch for me? Tell them I'm not a spy or a traitor, just someone who saw a problem and tried to fix it. The question carried weight beyond its words. Vouch for him, and Martha became complicit in his unauthorized program. Refuse, and she'd be betraying someone who'd sat behind her in some of the most dangerous skis she'd ever flown, who'd trusted her with his life and was now trusting her with his freedom. I'll tell them the truth, Martha said finally. That you're a brilliant officer who saw something wrong and took action, whether that makes you a hero or a criminal.